On the 14th of March 1902, a quarry foreman named Elias Tarbell stood at the lip of number 6 pit in West Rutland, Vermont, watching a powder crew finish tamping the last hole in a marble face the Vermont Marble Company had been cutting for 6 years. Tarbell was 41 years old, with 11 years in the pits behind him, and he had set enough charges in his life to know the sound a face makes when it lets go clean. This one did not sound clean. The charge went off at 11 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, and where the crew expected a fall of loose block, the face opened instead into a cavity that nobody in that pit had drilled, cut, or blasted for. Tarbell was the first man down the new opening. He carried a lantern roughly 40 feet in, by his own later account, and then he turned around, climbed back out, and did not go in again. Not that day, not the following week, not once in the 22 remaining years he worked for the company. He told the quarry superintendent what he had found. He never told anyone on paper why he stopped. The Vermont Marble Company kept a daily quarry log for number 6, the way it kept one for every working pit in West Rutland, a bound volume in which a clerk recorded blast times, crew names, tonnage estimates, and equipment notes in the same disciplined hand day after day. The entry for the 14th of March records the blast, the crew present, and the tonnage of loose block the powder crew expected to bring down. It does not record a cavity. It does not record Tarbell's descent, his exit, or his refusal. A man who had spent 11 years underground, in a company that documented tonnage to the pound, walked into something, and the company's own paperwork behaved as though nothing had happened at all. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who is paying attention. West Rutland sits inside the Taconic Marble Belt, a band of Cambrian and Ordovician dolomitic marble that runs the length of western Vermont and had been worked commercially since the 1830s. By 1900, the Vermont Marble Company controlled most of it, employing thousands of men across dozens of pits, and number 6 was one of the smaller working faces, cutting stone destined for courthouses, banks, and monuments across the country on a schedule measured in tons per day. A face that opened into empty space instead of solid rock was not, on its own, unusual in this belt. Pockets and solution cavities occur naturally in dolomitic marble, carved out over geologic time by groundwater moving along joints in the stone, and quarrymen encountered them often enough to have a name for the smaller ones and a standard procedure for clearing and mapping the larger ones. What made number 6 different was not that a cavity existed, it was what the cavity contained and what it did not. The opening ran back roughly 60 feet from the blast face, before narrowing into a passage a man could walk upright through, and the passage itself is where the record becomes specific rather than vague. The walls, according to the surviving quarry ledger entry made 2 weeks later by the pit's assistant clerk, a young man named Foster Aldrich, were dressed. Not fractured along natural bedding planes the way a solution cavity's walls fracture, uneven and undulating with the grain of the stone, but worked smooth and flat, in courses that met at consistent angles, for a stretch of nearly 30 feet before the passage's natural, unworked rock resumed on its far side. Aldrich measured the worked section with a carpenter's rule and recorded the wall height at 6 feet 9 inches, remarkably close to a uniform measurement along its full length, varying by less than half an inch anywhere he checked it, and noted a shallow channel cut into the floor, 4 inches wide, running the passage's center line from the point where the dressing began to the point where it stopped. He did not speculate on the channel's purpose. He wrote down what the rule told him, and nothing more, and his entry is the only first-hand physical description of number 6 that survives in the company's own records. No tool marks in the worked section match the drill and wedge or channeling bar methods the Vermont Marble Company used in 1902, and none matched the black powder or dynamite blasting the company had used for the preceding 2 decades to bring down rough block before the finishing crews took over. What the surface showed, in Aldrich's phrase, was a series of shallow, overlapping strike marks, close together, consistent in depth, running in one direction across each dressed stone, the kind of mark left by a hand tool swung with a steady, practiced motion rather than a machine bit or a channeling iron drawn along a track. A hand tool made those marks. A hand tool swung with enough consistency to leave a repeated depth and angle across 30 feet of marble, in a passage sealed behind solid rock that the company's own survey maps showed no prior working, mining, or excavation had ever approached from any direction. One detail in Aldrich's entry has drawn more attention from the handful of researchers who have examined it than any measurement he took. The floor of the worked section, he wrote, was clear, not swept in the sense of a fresh broom, but free of the rubble, loose chips, and blast debris that should have covered it after a charge brought down 30 feet of rock face directly in front of it. A quarry blast throws fragments in every direction reachable by the shockwave, and number 6's blast had been strong enough to open 60 feet of previously unknown passage. Yet the dressed section, the part that mattered most, held no scatter of broken stone across its floor, only the shallow channel Aldrich measured, running clean down its center. Someone, or something, had kept that 30 feet of floor clear long before Tarbell's lantern ever crossed it, and the blast that finally exposed it to daylight did nothing to change that. Horace Bicknell, the quarry superintendent, went down himself on the 16th of March, 2 days after the blast, accompanied by Aldrich and one other man whose name the surviving fragment does not give. Bicknell's report to the company's proctor office survives only in fragments, quoted second-hand in a 1929 company history commissioned for the firm's 50th anniversary, which describes an opening of some antiquity discovered in Pit 6, subsequently examined and reported upon, without saying what the report concluded, who read it, or where the original document went. That original has not surfaced in the company's surviving papers, held today at the Vermont Historical Society in Bar, catalogued and searchable, with the folder for number 6's 1902 correspondence noted by the archive's own finding aid as incomplete. What survives instead is the gap where the report should be. The quarry log for the 17th, 18th, and 19th of March, 3 consecutive working days immediately following Bicknell's descent, contains no entries at all. The pages are present, bound into the ledger, ruled and dated in advance the way the clerk always ruled and dated a week's pages at once. They are simply blank. The entry for the 20th resumes as though nothing had interrupted it, recording tonnage and crew assignments in the same clerk's hand, at the same steady pace as every week before and after. Bicknell ordered the opening in number 6 timbered off from the working face and left it that way. Quarrying continued around it on 3 sides for another 9 years, before the pit was worked out and abandoned in 1911, and in all that time no further mention of the timbered section appears in any surviving company correspondence. The company's own maps from that period show the section marked simply as unworked ground, a designation normally reserved for stone judged too fractured or low grade to be worth cutting, with no notation explaining why sound marble adjoining a discovery significant enough to warrant a superintendent's personal inspection would be left in the ground rather than quarried out around a sealed opening, an unusual gap in a company that otherwise mapped, priced, and accounted for every cubic foot of stone it did or did not intend to cut. Word of the discovery reached the state geologist's office in Burlington within the month, and a field geologist named Dr. Malcolm Sewell made the trip to West Rutland in April of 1902 to examine the passage before Bicknell had it sealed for good. Sewell's field notebook from that spring, preserved in the University of Vermont's Geology Department archive, contains detailed sketches of dolomitic solution features from 3 other Rutland County sites visited that same season, each cross-referenced, dated, and annotated with his usual methodical care, measurements running to the 1/4 inch. The entry for his visit to number 6 is 4 lines long. It records the date, the company's name, and a single sentence. Examined opening, worked surfaces present, requires further study. There is no sketch. Sewell had sketched every other cavity he examined that spring, in some cases across several pages, with cross-sections and compass bearings. For number 6, the one feature in his career that that most plainly demanded illustration. The man who spent his professional life cataloguing exactly this kind of geological anomaly drew nothing at all. Sewell's subsequent publications tell the rest of it. Before 1902, his work for the State Geological Survey concentrated almost entirely on the marble belt's karst features, the solution cavities, sinkholes, and underground drainage that made the region both valuable for quarrying and hazardous for it, a research focus he had pursued without interruption since joining the survey in 1896. After 1902, his output shifted, within 2 years, to hydrology and stream gauging in the Champlain watershed, a field adjacent to his training but distinct from it in method and in emphasis, and he did not publish another paper touching Rutland County marble karst for the remaining 20 years of his career. He never explained the shift in writing. Colleagues who wrote about him after his death in 1926 described him only as a careful, methodical man who preferred fieldwork to controversy, a description that fits everything about him except the one visit in his working life he chose not to document. If this investigation has your attention, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is more to uncover. Your support makes it possible to bring these buried histories to the surface. Number 6 was not the only northeastern quarry in this period to blast into a worked passage that its own crew declined to re-enter, and the two comparable cases that survive in any documentary form share Number 6's pattern with a precision that resists coincidence. In October of 1911, a bluestone quarry crew working a pit outside Saugerties in Ulster County, New York, blasted through a face and opened a passage with dressed walls and a floor channel matching Aldrich's 1902 description in almost every measurable respect. The Saugerties foreman, a man named Everett Shaw, according to a brief item in the Kingston Daily Freeman dated the following week, went in with a lantern, came out within minutes, and told his crew the opening was unsafe and should be left alone, a statement the newspaper item reproduces without further comment or follow-up. The company that worked the pit, the Ulster and Delaware Bluestone Company, closed the section within the month, and no state geologist's report on the find has ever been located in the New York State Museum's surviving field records, despite the museum's own active bluestone quarry survey program at that exact period. Bluestone is a sandstone, laid down under river delta conditions, not a dolomitic marble formed through the same slow process as the Vermont stone, and the two rocks share no common origin across roughly 200 miles and a wholly different geologic era. The tool marks the Freeman item described second-hand from crew testimony, close set, overlapping, consistent in depth and angle, match the marks Aldrich measured with his carpenter's rule in Vermont 9 years earlier, in a stone that has nothing else in common with what the Saugerties crew broke into. The second case comes from the slate belt around Pen Argyl, in Northampton County, Pennsylvania, where a quarryman named Otis Reenter struck a similar opening in September of 1919 while working a face for the Pennsylvania Slate Company. Renner's account survives only because his grandson gave an oral history interview to a county historical society in 1978, describing a passage his grandfather entered once, alone, and would not discuss afterward, beyond saying that the walls had been cut by hand and that the company ordered the section sealed within days of his report. No company record from the Pennsylvania Slate Company documenting the incident has been found among the firm's surviving papers, and the quarry itself was flooded and abandoned along with most of the district's other slate pits by the 1940s. Its workings now underwater and inaccessible without specialized diving equipment, the district has never funded an expedition to use. Both comparison cases share one further detail with Number 6 that neither newspaper item nor oral history dwells on, but neither omits. In Saugerties, Shaw's crew reported the passage floor bare of the quarry debris that should have covered it after a blast of that size, the same detail Aldrich had recorded in Vermont 9 years earlier. In Pen Argyl, Reenter told his grandson the floor of the passage he entered was, in his exact remembered phrase, swept like somebody kept it that way, a description close enough to Aldrich's clinical clear that the resemblance is difficult to attribute to two unrelated men independently choosing the same figure of speech across 2 different decades and 2 different states. 3 different stones, marble in Vermont, sandstone in New York, slate in Pennsylvania, each formed under its own conditions across its own span of geologic time, separated from one another by hundreds of miles, and in the marble's case, hundreds of millions of years of formation history that the sandstone and slate do not share. And in each case, a passage opens behind a blast, with walls dressed by hand tools rather than the company's own machinery, a foreman or crew leader who enters once and will not return, and an institutional record that closes around the discovery within days and then simply goes quiet. The company logs differ in every detail except the one that matters. Each contains a gap precisely where the discovery should be documented in the greatest detail, and each gap is followed immediately by a resumption of ordinary business as though the interruption had never occurred at all. What survives of number 6 today is smaller than what was lost, but it is not nothing. Foster Aldrich, the assistant clerk who measured the passage with his carpenter's rule, kept a fragment of dressed marble he chiseled loose from the worked section before Bicknell ordered it timbered off, roughly the size of a man's palm, showing 11 of the shallow overlapping strike marks along one edge. The fragment passed to his daughter, then to a grandson still living in Rutland County today, who has allowed it to be photographed and measured on 2 separate occasions, but has declined every request to donate it to any museum or historical society. It has never been carbon dated, since marble carries no organic material for that method to work on, and no metallurgical or lithic analysis beyond visual and tactile examination has ever been performed on it by any credentialed institution. It exists the way Newton Anderson's coal bell exists, outside the institutions that would otherwise have absorbed it into storage and silence, kept instead in a family's possession, available to anyone willing to make the drive to Rutland County and ask politely. Elias Tarbell died in 1931, still living in West Rutland, having worked in the marble industry for the whole of his adult life after that one refusal in March of 1902. Neighbors who remembered him, quoted decades later in a local history project compiled by the town library, described a practical, unsentimental man who talked freely about the pits, the drilling, the derricks, the men he had worked beside for 30 years, and who changed the subject every single time when number 6 came up in conversation. Not angrily, not evasively, in the manner of a man hiding something he was ashamed of. He simply would not go there in conversation any more than he would go there in the stone, and neighbors who pressed him gently were met with silence rather than argument. The quarry itself is gone now, flooded and grown over like most of the worked-out pits in West Rutland, its exact boundaries preserved only on company maps in the Historical Society's archive, where the section marked unworked ground still shows no notation explaining why soundstone was left standing rather than cut, catalogued and sold. What the passage in number 6 requires, if the surviving record is taken on its own terms, is not a monster or a myth, but an accounting. Somebody dressed 30 feet of stone wall by hand, to a tolerance measured in fractions of an inch, in a chamber sealed behind solid marble that no known excavation had ever approached, in a location and at a depth that places the work outside the reach of any documented culture assumed to have occupied this stretch of Vermont before the quarrymen arrived. The company that found it built its fortune on knowing exactly how much stone it owned and exactly what it was worth, and the one section it could not price, explain, or account for is the one section its own map left blank. Bicknell's report went somewhere. Sewell's missing sketch was drawn somewhere, if it was drawn at all, before whatever came after made him set the subject down for good. The gap in the ledger is not an absence of evidence. In a company built entirely on paperwork, the gap is the evidence, 3 ruled and dated pages that a careful clerk left empty because there was nothing he was permitted to write, and a foreman who carried what he saw in that passage for 22 years without once putting it into words, and a fragment of dressed stone still sitting today on a shelf in a house in Rutland County, waiting for someone to ask the right question about it. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen continue the investigation. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next one.